Listen, I'm very, very proud to be here. This means a great deal to me. And because of what I chose to do for a living, I've been afforded these kind of wonderful opportunities. But just so you know, not a movie star, not a famous guy. Tonight, I sit here, just an old Marine, telling a wonderful story about 6 of my older brothers who left footprints in the sand for a guy like me to try to follow. And God willing, we'll do it. No matter what they say. This is a true story. It's about 6 American boys from different parts of these United States. Now, what they had in common was their love of country, their innocence, their courage, and that overwhelming force called destiny, which threw them into one of the bloodiest battles in the history of our nation. February 23rd, 1945, they stood together and planted the Stars and Stripes on Mount Suribachi, a windswept piece of hell in the South Pacific. In a split second, the shutter clicked. The camera captured their image, and in a way, their very souls. For their lives were changed forever, along with the course of World War II and possibly the future of civilization. There were 6 Marines in that famous photo from Iwo Jima, but only one man transcended the event and lived through the human slaughter, the survivor's guilt, and the undesired notoriety. His name was John Bradley, and he grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin, a harmonious small town that evoked the comfortable feelings of a Norman Rockwell painting, if you will. John's dad worked hard on the railroad, dreaming of a better life for his kids. As a boy in the early 1930s, John walked home from school every day with a young neighborhood girl named Betty, and after the war, they got married and they raised 8 kids. For 47 years, they enjoyed a great marriage, but in all that time, John talked only once to his wife about Iwo Jima. The famous photograph was absent from the Bradley home. If a nosy newspaper reporter intruded on his modest life, his kids were instructed, just say your dad's on an extended fishing trip. Over the years, John Bradley avoided talking to the press about Iwo Jima. He almost never talked to his own family about the nightmare he'd lived through. He built a wall around the war. No need to share the horrendous images that haunted him. He was a private man who chose to close the book on that traumatic chapter of his life. John was a pillar pillar of his church and his community. But at age 70, his big heart seemed to wear out. He passed away in 1994. To the very end, he was religious and extremely humble. And he thought he'd taken to his grave a deep, deep secret. The truth is, a truth he had kept hidden for nearly 50 years. A few days after the crowded funeral service, his family made an astonishing discovery. Buried deep in a closet in their dad's office, they found 3 heavy cardboard boxes that held the key to John's closely guarded past. A new universe opened up to the family. Inside those boxes were pictures, letters, citations, and honors that came to John Bradley as one of the 6 flag raisers of Iwo Jima. Included was the historic picture of that day when those Marines struggled to push the American flag through the wind on top of Mount Suribachi. After appearing on the front page of the New York Times, it galvanized our nation. Every newspaper in the United States reproduced that shot, and folks everywhere saw heroes, hope, victory, and a powerful image that finally replaced the defeatist vision of the Pacific Fleet sinking at Pearl Harbor. Somehow this photo embodied the courage of America's Marines and raised the spirit of all our nation. There was another astounding secret in these boxes. Veterans' family found a citation which revealed that because of extraordinary valor, John Bradley had been awarded the Navy Cross. In his profound modesty, no one in the family even knew that he'd received one of our nation's highest military honors. A few days after this revelation, John's 4th son, Jim, flew back to his life as a writer on the East Coast. He sat in his study, gazed at the photograph framed on the wall. His dad was the most easily identifiable Marine in the picture, but the questions kept coming. Who were these other kids? Who were they? Where did they come from? What happened back on Iwo Jima that made his dad bury the past and maintain such a respectful code of silence? Jim was determined to find out everything he could about the flag raisers of Iwo Jima and his father's part in that historic battle. Flag raisers of that famous photo stared across time at Jim Bradley. Each young man had a name and a family and a story that needed telling. Well, let's start with Franklin Runyon Sousley. He was a rambunctious red-headed kid with a face full of freckles, a big country grin, He grew up dirt poor in a tobacco farm in the mountains of Kentucky. And he told his friends at the Hilltop General Store, "When I come back, I'll be a hero." Well, he was right, but in a way no one could have predicted. Ira Hayes, true American, in fact, a Native American from the Pima tribe. He grew up on the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona. The river used to flow and feed the reservation farmland till the government, in its infinite wisdom, dammed it upstream. Now the Gila River was hardly more than a dry gulch in a trickle, and the land was ruined. Now, Indians were not allowed to vote, but the government was happy to have him fight and die for his country. Ira Hayes had something in common with Franklin Sousley. They both came from families that barely got by on meager farms. Ira wanted to defend his nation, and the elders of his historically pacifistic tribe agreed. This was a war that had to be fought, and our enemy had to be defeated. You might say he was a loner. He was. But he was determined to fight for his country. By contrast, Rene Gagnon was very sociable. He was the only child of French-Canadian mill workers who settled in New Hampshire. His folks split up when he was just a baby, and Rene was raised by his mother. He's a handsome young kid, bore a striking resemblance to the matinee idol Tyrone Power. Rene's Army drafts notice found him working in the Union mills at 1943, but he saw a Marine recruitment poster and figured he looked pretty damn smart and dashing in that dress blue uniform. So he made kind of a fashionable decision, went for the glamour and the glory. And at age 17, he joined the Marines. Now, Harlan Block, he grew up in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Ball of energy, loved to ride his white horse galloping across the small farms along the Mexican border. His mother raised him in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ironically, he was taught never to carry weapons. The good Lord would offer all the protection the faithful would ever need. But she couldn't keep her son insulated from the aggressive fever infecting the world. Harlan's natural physical talents led him to star on the local football team. In 1943, after an undefeated season, with dreams of extending their gridiron glory, Harlan and 13 of his teammates joined the Marines together. Despite the recruiter's promise never to break the team up, they were shipped off to different units. A fate which was wildly disappointing, but, you know, probably saved many of their lives in the long run. Mike Strank. He was a veteran of the Flag Regiment. He's 4 years older than most of the other kids. He was a classic immigration story. Mike was born in Czechoslovakia. His father, seeking to improve the future of his impoverished family, traveled alone through Ellis Island on his way to the steel mills of Pennsylvania. 3 long years later, in 1922, the hard-working miner had earned the money to bring his wife and son from the old country to join him in America. the land of opportunity. With his photographic memory, Mike learned quickly everything from the English language to how to play the French horn. Life improved for the family as they chased the American dream till the Great Depression shattered their momentum. After high school, jobs were scarce, but Mike heard about President Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps. And he joined the CCCs, working around the country, building highways and bridges. When Hitler invaded and crushed his Czech home in 1939, he wanted to be part of something that would stop the Nazis from enslaving his people. 19 years old, he joined the Marines. With his superior intellect, tough physique, he excelled as a Marine. He became a raider. His natural leadership skills turned him into sergeant strength. Signed up to stop Hitler in Europe, but he was sent to the jungles and the bloody battles of the South Pacific. Harlan Block and Ira Hayes also fought in those vicious island campaigns. By 1943, John Bradley was hitchhiking from Appleton to Oshkosh to join the Navy. A year later, he was transferred to Field Medical School to become a Marine medic. Boot camp with the Marines was the toughest training in the world. Recruits Franklin, John, and Renee met Pacific veterans Corporal Harlan Block, paratrooper Ira Hayes, Sergeant Mike Strank in Camp Pendleton, California. They were all part of a newly created 5th Division. Tens of thousands poured into Camp Pendleton to train in the special island warfare that needed to defeat the Japanese. The Six Flag Raisers were now part of a 250-man unit known as Easy Company. Given their future, the name could not have been more misleading. By July 1944, a man of great importance was intensely watching their training from the sand dune. Turns out it was their commander-in-chief, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Six months after the rigorous training began, the hardened division was known as Spearhead. They shipped out of San Diego. They're bound for Hawaii. This is no paradise. Knife-edge lava rock made it the perfect, miserable place to train for 4 more grueling months. The final destination was top secret, but the armada of 800 ships would gather to transport the massive invasion force across the ocean. Behind every Marine stood thousands of round-the-clock factory workers, families on ration, victory gardens, and the prayers of a unified nation. 70,000 Marines were on their way, backed by the collective might of America. The sleeping giant was fully awake. Emperor of Japan personally selected Lieutenant General Suribachi to design and command the defense of Iwo Jima. A samurai descendant, the general graduated from Japan's top military school and then went on to study in the United States for 5 years. Despite his admiration for the United States, Suribachi and his 22,000 devoted troops took an oath to fight to their deaths. Having analyzed the German defeat and massive Allied invasions at Normandy, Suribachi created new groundbreaking defenses. He hid his ghost army beneath the surface, riddling Iwo Jima with 16 miles of tunnels and interconnecting caves, command posts, and pillboxes. Deep underground, impervious to U.S. bombing, the Japanese turned the small island into an impregnable subterranean fortress. Since it loomed over the only possible landing site for the Americans, the Japanese transformed Mount Suribachi into a giant killing tower. The 22,000 defenders that made it a suicide pact. Their goal was to inflict such awful casualties that the will of the Marines and the will of the American people would crumble in the face of such horrific losses. The Japanese believed that after the bloodbath, the Americans would never have the audacity, the heart, or the stomach to invade Japan itself. Resigned to his impending death, General Suribachi wrote to his son before the battle, "The life of your father is but a lamp before the wind." Years earlier, he'd written to his wife, "The United States is the last country in the world Japan should try to fight." After 2 years of feverish preparation, the invading force of 100,000 Americans amassed off Iwo Jima. D-Day, February 19, 1945, marked the 75th day of continuous shelling by the Navy. The Marine landing craft launched in the land of the rising sun.
was quiet, and it was eerily quiet. The Japanese strategy was let the Marines land unopposed. And they waited till the beaches were packed with Marines and equipment bogged down in the black sand that clung like mud. Then the gates of hell opened. Japanese position on Mount Suribachi erupted with mortars, machine guns, and artillery. The bullets were so thick. Photographer Joe Rosenthal remembered the landing. Not getting hit, he said, was like running through the rain and not getting wet. The slaughter of our Marines was worse than Normandy after only 2 days of fighting. $3,650 dead Marines, maimed or missing. More horrible than 5 months of casualties on Guadalcanal. Yet somehow, these young American heroes found the courage to push forward, inch by inch, clawing their way through the sand, fighting for their country, and dying with their friends. More medals of valor were awarded in the action on Iwo Jima than for any other battle in the history of the United States. Ultimately, the Marines were victorious, but after a huge cost. Bradley's unit, Easy Company, hit the beach with 310 men, suffered 84% casualty. Only 50 Marines from Easy Company walked off Iwo Jima under their own power. Call it providence, dumb luck, or destiny, but some unseen force seemed to determine who would live or who would die in the weeks spent fighting on Iwo Jima. Doc Bradley's role as a medic should have shortened his life. Running out fearlessly into the open to help the wounded, he was a welcome and easy target. And the Japanese were even encouraged to shoot medics. But Bradley miraculously was protected by a higher force. He saved countless lives. By the 5th day of the battle, Mount Suribachi had been gallantly silenced. But no Marines had reached the summit. A platoon was sent up to check the caves of the tunnels. The odds were slim that this outfit would come back in one piece. Expecting casualties, a medic was sent, so Doc Bradley climbed along. Later, orders were given, run up a field telephone wire to the top. Fate chose Mike, Franklin, Renee, Ira, and Harlan for the job. They were also to bring a flag rescued from a ship destroyed at Pearl Harbor. The brass demanded the flag be run up high so every son of a bitch on this cruddy island could see it. The ascent was joined by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal. When they made the summit, Harlan Block started stacking stones for a makeshift base. Mike Strank attached the flag to a pole. They asked John Bradley for a hand, so he dropped his bandages and put his shoulder
into it. Rosenthal snapped off a few shots, not even looking through his viewfinder. He had no idea he had just taken the most famous photograph in history. Battle for Iwo Jima was far from finished. 4 more weeks of hell were coming. Thousands more would make the ultimate sacrifice. Sergeant Mike Strank was killed 6 days after the photo was taken. Corporal Harlan Block took over as squad leader, but he was killed before the sun set on the same day. A week later, Franklin Sousley's life was cut short by a sniper's bullet. Doc Bradley bravely laid his life on the line to help the wounded time and time again. The day after heroics that would earn him the Navy Cross, Bradley's legs were ripped by shrapnel out from under him. He was shipped to a hospital in Hawaii. He was lucky, for half the men in the picture were now dead. Still, the photograph was taking on a life and a mythology of its own. As John Bradley said, the real heroes of Iwo Jima are the kids that didn't come back. The photograph lay unexposed, a roll of film that was unceremoniously tossed into a mailbag bound for Guam. There it was developed and treated casually until the Associated Press editor saw the first print. He knew he was looking at a masterpiece, and he screamed out, "Here's one for all time." The shot was instantly sent over the wires around the world. By the next morning, millions were transfixed by the image on the front page of the Times. The supernatural momentum of the shot snowballed across America. In one of his last acts, President Roosevelt sent an order out, "Find those Marines, the ones in that flag-raising picture." Once found, they were to be flown back to Washington immediately. Commander-in-Chief needed these kids for a new mission. Government was running out of money. Back then, the huge cost of war was placed outside the federal budget. A 7th war bond drive was crucial. Roosevelt knew that in our democracy, he needed the full financial support of the people to continue this war. These new heroes would inspire folks to dig deep. Roosevelt had to raise $100 for every man, woman, and child in America. The staggering goal was $14 billion. This campaign was crucial to the outcome of the war. The Battle of Iwo Jima was over, but the search for the survivors in the photo was on. Renee and Ira were on a Navy ship headed for the Marshall Islands.
They found Rene first, told him of the presidential plan to parade him around the country. He was thirsty for the glory. But when Ira Hayes got wind of those plans, they offended his sense of honor. He didn't want to be on display as a hero, especially when most of the Easy Company was never coming home. Ira Hayes told Rene, "If you name me as one of the 6 men in that picture, I'll kill you." That threat made a big impact on Rene, and he kept his mouth shut all the way back to Washington. But under interrogation from the top Marine brass, he finally gave up Ira's identity. John Bradley was flown from the hospital in Hawaii to Bethesda. Ira Hayes was plucked from the South Pacific and flown to Marine headquarters near the capital. Rene had already made his way back to Manchester, Vermont, and the front page of the newspaper. And the governor met Rene, who gave a speech to the state legislature. A parade was scheduled in his honor, but horrible news canceled his small triumph. President Roosevelt died that very day. The nation mourned, but the war raged on. The mighty 7th War Drive, planned by FDR, had to go forward. Started with a golden photo opportunity for the White House press. John Bradley, still on crutches, kept an uneasy peace between Ira and Rene as they met the new president. Standing in front of the mighty 7th Fleet poster, President Truman shook their hands and declared each one of them a national hero. The surreal journey continued. Next stop, the U.S. Senate chamber. Boys got slapped on the back by the most powerful citizens in our country. And that night they were introduced to a crowd of 24,000 at the game between the Yankees and the Washington Senators. Later, they took the train up to Grand Central Station, New York, then on to Times Square. Mayor LaGuardia led tens of thousands of people who came to see the trio perform a reenactment of the flag raising over Mount Suribachi. Across the nation, they shared the stage with big movie stars like Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. And for 8 weeks, the boys were the centerpiece of the biggest patriotic media blitz ever unleashed on the American public. Truly turned upside down for these 3 Marines. Just weeks ago, they were watching their buddies get blown to bits. Now the government, ably assisted by the media, did their best to create a myth that elapsed the humble truth of these Easy Company survivors. People were just dying to touch their new heroes. Many wanted to buy him a drink. Booze flowed after banquets. Ira Hayes, he found that hard to resist. The liquor helped insulate him from the circus that had become their lives. 100,000 people cheered the boys in Chicago. War bonds were selling like hotcakes. The tour grossed half of the total federal budget for 1946. Double the original goal. Drinks flowed in celebration. Ira Hayes went missing. Police found him drunk, wandering the streets of the Windy City. There was a mad scramble to sober him up before the show. 50,000 people waited for them at Soldier Field. The trio, with Ira hung over, awkwardly hoisted the flag over a huge replica of Mount Suribachi. That was the beginning of the end for Ira. A few cities later, the hard-drinking Indian was kicked off the tour and ordered to rejoin the remnants of Easy Company. See, that's what he wanted. John and Renee stayed with the tour, but were exhausted from the round-the-clock travel and the press. Even Renee was ready to go home and get one of those cushy jobs that powerful people had promised him when the patriotic fever that was over that gripped America. Only John Bradley sensed that after the hoopla, after the flag waving was over, the well-intended promises would evaporate in the wind. He had done his duty now and was ready to resume his modest life and leave Iwo Jima far behind. Renee, he spent the rest of his life waiting for his ship to come in. One week he appeared with John Wayne in the sands of Iwo Jima, a movie that exploited the famous pose to boost box office sales. A week later, he'd be back at his job as a janitor, waiting for his ship to come in. Never came in. His hopes for cashing in were always just slightly out of reach, and it was that way the rest of his life. In 1947, the government began transporting the remains of the Marines killed on Iwo Jima. Franklin Sousley's casket came home to the mountains of Kentucky. Veterans fired a rifle salute that echoed through the empty valleys. His mom wept while the governor held her hand. As the red-kidded kid with a big grin had predicted 4 years earlier, he came back all right, and he came back a hero. Corporal Harlan Block made the journey back home to Texas. On hand were 20,000 mourners and the surviving members of his football team who'd enlisted with him. They led the horses, pulling the wagon that carried his flag-draped coffin. Sergeant Mike Strank was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. A busload of family and friends came down from Pennsylvania. It was fitting that the young man who everyone said was the best Marine they ever served with would be buried in this hallowed ground. Now Ira, he kept trying to reconcile. Why was he still alive and these others were dead? So many tormenting questions. The bottle offered temporary solace, but it shattered his life. He was a curiosity now, a noble but haunted soul who eventually drank himself to death. He passed out in the desert night after night, drowning in the horrible images of Iwo Jima. Froze to death, face down in the barren soil of the reservation. Thousands lined up to view his body, which lay in state under the rotunda of the Arizona Capitol. That powerful image, shot on Mount Suribachi, resonates through time. It became an obsession for sculptor Felix de Weldon. Started working with clay when the photograph was published. He spent the next 9 years, $850,000 to create his project. Every penny was donated by American citizens, wasn't paid for by the government. Most of the donations came from Marines. The Marine Corps Memorial is a colossal work, weighing more than 100 tons. And the legend and the truth live in the hearts of the American people, along with the valor of the Marines that inspired the creation of this sacred memorial. The last time the three surviving flag raisers saw each other was at the unveiling of the memorial on November 10th, 1954. That's the Marine Corps birthday. The parents of Mike, Franklin, and Harlan were there, along with President Eisenhower and 7,000 dignitaries. The magnitude of the giant figures took the breath away from all who viewed the monument. The bronze immortals towered over the survivors, who looked up in awe, trying to find themselves, and the metamorphosis was now complete. Out of the myth and image, now welded together, emerged a new creation, larger than their individual lives could ever be. Now, if you walk around the granite base of the memorial, you will not see a plaque that states the names of those kids who raised that flag and braved the hell of Iwo Jima. That image, the flag these Marines pushed toward the heavens, now represents the spirit of all brave young men and women who sacrificed so much for their country. There is one subscription on the memorial that states, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." When John Bradley died, the editor of the local paper wrote, "He will live forever and be memorialized for a few moments' action on top of a remote Pacific mountain. We here prefer to remember him for his life." The future of our nation will continue to be built on the backs and the spirit and the honor of our quiet heroes.
That's about enough. Thanks for your clapping and your attention. And isn't that a wonderful story? God bless this great nation that produces people like that, boys like that, girls like that, who are willing to give their life so that we can have a night like this all together. I thank God for them every day, and I hope you do too.